Welcome to the First Buck Podcast, where we feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people who support them. Now, let's get started with the show.
Hello, and welcome to the First Buck Podcast, brought to you by skyslimit.org. We feature stories about entrepreneurs and the people that support them. Today, we're joined by Jeff Lynn, co-founder and chairman of Seedrs, and chairman of the Startup Coalition. He began his career as a lawyer with Sullivan and Cromwell in New York and in London before moving into the world of entrepreneurship 15 years ago. He has been named one of the 10 coolest people in UK tech by Business Insider and one of the most influential men in Britain by GQ. So we're very lucky to have Jeff with us today. He has a huge amount of experience supporting entrepreneurs. And so, Jeff, we have a little tradition around here. How did you earn your first buck?
Well, first, thanks very much, Nick, for having me, and great to be on here. So my first buck was actually entrepreneurial, even though I ultimately started my career in a fairly kind of traditional way as a lawyer. As a kid, a friend of mine and I loved sports. We're American, so sports rather than sport. Loved sports. We're not terribly good at any of them, but really enjoyed them. But what we were good at was writing about them. And so we started a little sports magazine of sorts. I mean, printed on sort of a home copier and using whatever, 1989 sort of era software we had. But we started putting together, it was called Stars of Sports. And it was just, some articles about sports-related things that were of interest to us. Looking back, I'm sure they were absolutely terrible, but we would go door to door to neighbors and sell it for 50 cents. I think maybe it was 25 cents at first, and then we got really confident and went up and walked up 50 cents. And we even got the local little news agent in our town to display it on consignment. He wouldn't buy it off of us, but he'd put it on the stand, and if anybody bought it, he'd pass us the proceeds. And no great fortune made, but it was a fantastic early exposure to go out and creating something and make a little bit of money for ourselves. So that was my first buck.
Wow, I didn't know you started off as a media mogul. I guess the storytelling and everything else it all sort of clicks now. So let's skip forward a little bit. Talk to us about some of those kind of pivotal moments in your career where you sort of accumulated some knowledge, consolidated, and then expanded again, and sort of, what are the things that sort of brought you to becoming interested in supporting entrepreneurship, ultimately at Seedrs and then in your role in the Startup Coalition?
Yeah, absolutely. So I guess, there've been loads and I would love to be able to point to sort of a single big bang that changed it all. But the reality is that, as often happens in life, these things are a little more kind of incremental and staged, and you don't quite realize that they form a path until after you're down it. But I suppose a few kind of key ones. One was the experience I had practicing law. I was a sort of junior to mid-level corporate lawyer in New York and London. Intellectually, very interesting work. I was very lucky. I got to do some great work, but we were doing, I was primarily an M&A lawyer doing very, very big deals, as part of a big deal team, working with one bank, taking over another bank, et cetera. And what I kept seeing there was this was really interesting. The paperwork and all was fun and we're working crazy hours and all that. But not a whole lot of value was being created. And actually, I think, we were doing a lot of work to ultimately destroy value in the end. And then at the same time, one of the things happens when you're a kind of young lawyer is that friends who are doing startups are doing their own thing, kind of try to get free legal advice off of you. So I managed to get a little bit of exposure to some entrepreneurial people who had nothing, no money, nothing behind them, but they were coming up with these really super creative ideas. And I was just blown away by the fact that this is where value gets created. And so, even though I guess I'd always had a little bit of an entrepreneurial instinct that was a point, not a single day, but that set of experiences in my early career certainly led me to think, what, I want to be with those guys somehow. I don't quite know how, I don't quite know, what the route in is, but I want to do that. And so ultimately I decided to leave the law, went back to get an MBA with a view to doing something entrepreneurial. And it was during the MBA program that I met my co-founder, Carlos Silva, who become my co-founder of Seedrs, and we started working on what became Seedrs. And then I guess that was the sort of second pivotal moment where, we'd started working together along with a few other people, all as part of an academic project. When I went to business school at Said at Oxford, and one of the things I really liked about it, one of the things that drew me there, I don't necessarily believe, just to preempt a question that often comes up, I don't believe an MBA is in any way necessary to be an entrepreneur. I think, and in some cases, depending on how you do it, it can probably be, it can probably undermine entrepreneurship. But done right and with the right angle and the right focus, I think it can be valuable. And Said Business School is really very strong on entrepreneurship. And one of the things they did was, regardless of your career aspirations, everybody had to, as one part of the course, get together and do an entrepreneurship project, which involved coming up with a full business plan and proposing a full idea. And Carlos and I and a couple other people started working on what would become Seedrs. It was Carlos's idea. He sold me on it. I loved it. We all started working on it, but thinking like, oh, this is just a nifty academic project. And then one day, we knew the other guys on the program, had other career ambitions, but Carlos and I went out to lunch one day and sort of looked at each other and said, this thing works. Like this, we could do this. You want to do this? Let's do it. And, from that kind of moment on, I was an entrepreneur. Really kind of, that was, when was that? It was 2008, sort of never quite looked back from that moment. And then loads of little additional points, highs and lows along the way. But those were probably the two most important pivotal kind of periods for me.
Yeah, I think it's so important for entrepreneurs to hear that, there are many different paths to getting started. And, your background, it doesn't matter if you went to the best business school or not in the world. Ultimately, you got to take your experiences, what you can do, and try and create value in the world and do something other people want to pay you for. And if you can do that and do it a little bit better and keep getting better at it, there's a path there.
Absolutely right. And I was very lucky with my education that, I had the opportunity to go to a few great universities, and I wouldn't say for a moment that I don't value that. I do, and they're great, but by no means. And for all the entrepreneurs I've seen through the years, it's one of the fields I think that has the least correlation to sort of formal credentials and formal background. You can figure out and learn the things you need. If you have an entrepreneurial mindset and you want to do it, you can learn the things you need at a top university. You can learn the things you need, just in the community and working with other people. And as you say, there are so many different paths in, and unlike many careers that have these sort of stage, milestones you have to hit, entrepreneurship, is so much more fluid in that way.
It's such a good point. So earlier we learned how you earned your first buck with the magazine about sports. In your career a little bit further forward in the Seedrs context, what was something like, when did you take maybe like a kind of big risk, and how did you evaluate that risk, and what was the ROI of it, and how do you kind of get the confidence to really put yourself out of the comfort zone of the business and try to do something risky or difficult?
Yeah. Well, I kind of feel like it's all been a risk, or a succession of risks. I mean, I think, part of why I often say about myself that, I think I was and am a pretty good founder, but not a particularly good business leader. And why I handed over to a professional, an experienced CEO after we raised our Series A and continue to focus on the very early stages of things, is that I am somebody who kind of likes to throw things at the wall and see what sticks. And in early days, when you're first experimenting and first trying new things, it's hard to measure the ROI in any meaningful way. But what you can measure is that the cost is pretty low. And if it works, it can be a really, really big upside. And so, if 10% of the kind of wacky ideas you come up with wind up actually sticking, but the 90% that don't haven't cost you a whole lot to try, at least in some basic way, there's really nothing particularly wrong with that. So I think we've had, I've certainly taken a long succession of risks. And, the first one probably being that, in starting Seedrs, one of the things about what we do, which is an investment-based crowdfunding platform, is it hadn't been done before on a regulated basis. And so we were going to have to not only build out a business model and a platform, but we were going to have to convince the regulators to approve something that they had never approved before. And, in the end, we had no idea it would take this long. But in the end, that was a 3-year process. And we very easily and very nearly we could have and very nearly did come to the end of that 3 years and have the regulators say, nope. That would have been that. It would have been 3 years for kind of nothing. That was, and we're very fortunate that didn't happen. I don't know. I was 30 then. I'm 45 now. I don't know that at this stage in my life, I could stomach that level of risk again. I'm not sure. But somehow or another back then, I was able to do it. Some sleepless nights and everything. But thankfully, it paid off.
I think there's some pearls of wisdom in there, especially early on when you're trying to find, a product market fit or building a service and making sure you really understand what your client challenges are, is to probably try a bunch of different things, but not do necessarily one that potentially overwhelmingly risks the opportunity. And so I always kind of refer to this as like chasing the energy. When you start to understand that something is working, that a customer is giving you, feedback and you can anticipate their needs, that's good energy. If you try something and it's just not being well listened to, or you're just not getting anything out of it, sometimes you just have to like subtract that out and then keep chasing where the energy is coming from. So that makes a lot of sense. I think waiting for the regulator to approve something is always a concerning sort of thing on a dependency from someone there. But it was also clearly such an important, good idea to be able to support more entrepreneurs and more crowdfunding, making it possible for people in their neighborhoods to invest in their neighbors. This is a really pioneering way of capital formation that you're really responsible for, and it's set an incredible precedent. Because in the United States, a lot of people don't realize, but unless you're an accredited investor, you may not actually be able to invest legally in a small business that a friend or a business relationship you have is starting. And so there are all these sort of prohibitive rules that make it impossible for people to help each other.
I mean, historically, that's been true, almost everywhere. It has been exceptionally difficult to be able to just invest a small amount of money in a friend's business, partially for regulatory reasons, partially for sort of transaction cost reasons, and otherwise. And certainly, one of the things we have fought for both in building Seedrs, but I've also been a strong advocate toward policymakers in the UK and Europe, in the US and elsewhere, is that, this is a good thing. It comes with risks. Startups are risky. You do not want sort of ordinary people investing their life savings in them. That would be a terrible idea. And you have to have the controls in place to make sure that doesn't happen. But at its core, this is we were building this, starting this sort of in the wake of the financial crisis of the late noughties. And, there were a lot of people who felt, I think not wrongly, that something had gone wrong in capitalism, not necessarily that capitalism itself is a flawed concept, but that it had taken a wrong turn somehow in the subprime lending crisis and in the way that the major financial institutions operated. And I'm a big believer that what we do at Seedrs and investing in small businesses where you care about what they're doing and you believe in their potential success sort of gets capitalism back to its core, gets back to the where free markets and where investment are meant to be and can work well. And it's been a real privilege to not only be able to build that, but also advocate for it.
Well, I think a lot of small and medium-sized and now big businesses are grateful for that vision. So selling a product or a service is kind of a key skill for any business leader or founder. Can you talk about a memorable business deal that you closed, how you went about it, maybe share some wisdom about that with our audience?
Yeah, I mean, I think one that comes to mind, and this is another sports-related one, which is going to sound very odd because at least today I'm one of the less sort of sporty and sport-focused people you'll meet. So it's strange. Quite so much of my career has interacted with it, but we in sort of 2015, so a couple of years after we finally launched, and just as we were beginning to get a bit of traction, we closed a partnership deal that continued very successfully for 3 years with Andy Murray, the tennis player, who was at the height of his Powers then. I mean, it was, we closed the deal either right before or right after he had won Wimbledon as the first men's British champion in 77 years. Was a great figure and somebody I admire tremendously. And, again, I think, not to sort of digress too much, but, one of the things I've always liked about Andy is that I think he, in some ways, represents, or has a certain analog to sort of successful entrepreneurs in that he's not super polished. He's not, for tennis fans out there, he's not Tim Henman. He's not this sort of, hugely well-spoken, well-polished guy. He's a bit rough. He's a bit gritty, but he has fought and worked so hard in building his career and to achieve what he achieved. And like what that stood for. Then what happened there was that word had come to us that he was interested in getting more involved in small business investment, that he really had a passion for supporting entrepreneurs. I think like many great athletes, starting to look to what happens for the next stage of his career after tennis. But he was really interested in this. And, we did the sort of entrepreneurial thing through a mix of kind of slightly strained connections and sort of knocking on doors. We got into his people and put together a proposal where, he would both be a sort of spokesman, brand ambassador for the platform, but also be actively investing through the platform so that we could actually point to, a lot of our deals where Andy was a personal investor. I remember that, the discussions were fascinating in part because we're talking two different worlds. His team were sports management guys. Crowdfunding was a new world to them. The sports management and licensing a new world to us. So we were talking slightly different languages, but there was a huge amount of good intent, a little bit of creativity. And, in the end, we got the deal done. And
oh, man, I don't think I knew this one at all.
Yeah.
I can totally see it because like Andy Murray's always sort of, I think he sees himself as an underdog, almost in every kind of stat. And like, that's something every entrepreneur can relate to too. And you could see why he would be deeply aligned with the work because of that. That's cool.
Yeah.
I had no idea about that. All right. So you've hired a bunch of different people across your career. What are some of the things you've learned about that? I think hiring is one of the hardest things to do well. What have you learned about the process or maybe the types of character, behavioral traits or questions that you find helpful in that process?
So it's a really interesting question. And I don't necessarily consider myself a super talented interviewer. I mean, I sit in on interviews with people who really kind of get into, levels of detail that I don't instinctively go to. And part of that, I think, comes from the fact that I learned to interview in the law firm world, where starting out, being interviewed myself, where generally, the interviews are very broad and there's a lot of tell us about yourself and, talk to us a little bit about what you're interested in and things like that. Very sort of broad and open-ended questions. And those are the questions I tend to ask as well. But the advantage to them, and the reason I keep doing that, and the reason I haven't shifted my approach particularly, is I find it very, very useful to see how people articulate whatever the subject they're talking about is. And I'm often less interested in the content of what they have to say than I am in how they structure it, how they think about it. And again, there's a little bit of a lawyer's bias to that, but I think for many, many roles, particularly senior management ones where it is a little bit less about skill set in the end and more about how you operate in a complex, changing, a highly dynamic environment. An ability to think clearly and express your thoughts clearly is really quite a top priority for me. And I think for the most part that has worked. Now it has its drawbacks, and there's a reason you have multiple people interview candidates, because there can be people who are just really excellent at selling themselves, but don't then have as much substance below the base. And once or twice through the years, I think I've gotten, maybe more than once or twice, I think I've perhaps been duped by that. I put too much reliance on the sort of confidence and ability to self-articulate. But for the most part, I think that has worked. And as I think back to the hires that I've made through the years that have worked out. And really very many have. I mean, I have often said, not facetiously, that I think that, one of the great bits of value I brought to Seedrs through the years was that I somehow persuaded a bunch of really talented people to work with us. And I think in each case, there was something about that generalist interview that really I found worked for me. So, to listeners and to others out there, I don't want to overstate that. I mean, I think certainly if you're hiring somebody to do code for you, you need to test that they know how to code. If you're hiring somebody to do performance marketing, you need to make sure that they understand, how the various marketing channels work. So you can't rely totally on that, but at least one element of an interview process being that generalist side of things, I have found very valuable.
Yeah, I think it's a good way to think about it, is almost having a few filters in place. One is sort of like, how does this person talk about their experience, what their storytelling is like. I always try and ask them to teach me something they know a lot about. It doesn't have to be about the company, but just how they go about the process of explaining a problem and scaffolding data. Multiple people interviewing is an obvious one. You've got blind spots, you have biases. You have to bring in different perspectives into a process to do it well. And then I think that last one is you got to test the skills. If you're hiring this person for a specific function or role, you got to know that they can actually do it. You should have a test or a quiz. But those are all good ones. All right. So one of the questions I always want to get an answer to is, who was the most important mentor to you? Who helped you when you were down or you just had challenges or struggles? And what was that relationship like?
So I have what may be a fairly somewhat controversial view on mentorship, which I can probably sum up as saying, I have had loads and loads and loads of people who have given me small bits of help at specific times to whom I'm very grateful. But I have never found, and I haven't witnessed a whole lot either, that kind of what people think of as that classic mentorship relationship where there's one person who really sits and guides over time. I had not seen that be successful as much as one might hope to. And I don't know if that I'm just a bit of a cynic. I don't know if, I don't quite know why that is. But, I will carve out certain exceptions. I learned a huge amount about business from my father and from people growing up, but I sort of put them in a different category. But as the years have gone by, I think that, I have found much more value taking sort of individual pearls of wisdom, individual questions, quick conversation. And I remember particularly when I first started in Seedrs, I had the chance to meet some of the, great entrepreneurs and investors out in Silicon Valley, Reid Hoffman and Chris Sacca and others. I remember those conversations. I remember, just in a few minutes picking up a huge amount from them. But they certainly wouldn't have considered themselves mentors to me. They wouldn't know who the heck I was. I never really found it. As I say, I haven't witnessed a huge amount of that sort of direct kind of one-on-one sport. So and that's not meant to be a negative comment. I think, again, to your listeners, I would say that if you find somebody, particularly somebody who not only has experience, but has the time and dedication and really does want to sit in and support, by all means, take advantage of that. Don't, it's not my comments aren't a reason to reject it. But I guess I think that, in most cases, many of the entrepreneurs I've known have found the most value has come from, a series of different sort of people providing small bits of support rather than one providing a large amount. That's been my experience, at least.
I like the perspective of almost like combing a beach and collecting the bits of glass that are beautiful and kind of collating all of those as they come. That makes a lot of sense.
I also think, I guess the other thing I would say is I think triangulating the information you get is from people who are trying to help is super important, because I don't think anybody has all the answers, and particularly in if you're trying to build an innovative business where you're trying to do something new, by definition, the people who've been there and done that don't have all the answers, but they might have some of them. And so if you take a bit from this person, a bit from that bit, and you start to hear repeated themes, and then you start to identify where the outliers are, that can be a very useful exercise in and of itself, I think.
Yep, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, last question. So taking a step to pursue entrepreneurship can be really kind of scary. What advice would you have for first-time entrepreneurs to deal with kind of maybe taking the leap and handling the stress?
Yeah, look, it is hard, but it is the first, and acknowledging that. I mean, I think the number one thing is not to sort of pretend or repress the stress and the challenges that come with it. Acknowledging it's hard. I mean, I think the most important thing is to have something of a network around you, whether that's family, whether that's friends, whoever, from where you can step away from it a bit. Because one of the things I think about building a business is it is all encompassing. It is 24 hours a day. It's with you in your sleep. It's with you in so many ways. And, there are times when there's just so much value, even though it'll never be fully off your mind, but there's so much value in being able to just talk about something else, think about something else. For some people that may even be hobbies, even solitary hobbies. Having the opportunity to have some sort of reprieve or alleviation of it, I think is very important. And then look, I think the other thing is to try, and this is much easier said than done, but to try to remind yourself that it's in most cases it's not as good as as it could be, and it's not as bad as it could be. I spent so much time thinking either, oh, if only we can do this one thing, then we're set and everything's done, or, oh God, if this thing happens, we're dead, it's over. And reality is most things in life, you have some ups, you have some downs, but you sort of manage to keep soldiering through, and worrying about the extreme catastrophes or overly focusing on the extreme bits of good luck or success, rarely gets you very far.
Yeah, that's great. And I think the message is, entrepreneurs can also find a lot of comfort around other entrepreneurs. And that's you're not alone in all of this. And to seek out those who can support you during your journey is so important.
And particularly those who will speak honestly. Because there is the problem in entrepreneurship of the sort of smashing it culture. You talk to people, how's your business going? Smashing it, it's going amazing. And then you sit there thinking to yourself, oh God, mine's not so much.
Yeah, it's like an early version of social media, right? Like every time you log in, you're like, oh, everyone's
winning these. Exactly. And when you can find other entrepreneurs who are actually willing to talk honestly about, the problems they're facing, and, and all that, can be very productive because you can sometimes help each other think through. But also I find, that's a lot more rewarding than just hearing everyone else has just raised a $300 million round and you're struggling to make payroll.
Totally. All right, Jeff, thank you so much. At skyslimit.org, we connect underrepresented entrepreneurs with volunteer business professionals for free one-on-one mentoring. We also provide business guides to all of our mentors, plus monthly funding opportunities, all for free. So if you like what you heard, please subscribe and share. And special thank you to Jeff for joining us today. Cheers.
Thanks for listening to the First Buck Podcast. Don't forget to join the community of underrepresented entrepreneurs and their supporters by signing up at skysthelimit.org. Click subscribe, and we'll see you next time.